I'm Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture. Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live from the unceded lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation, right here in the Karam Karam Swamp, where today we even have some cockatoos and galahs outside the station window chirping away. So if you hear some noises, it's right here live from the Karam Karam, thriving and getting ready for spring to come. My guest and conversation partner this evening is David Thomas, who was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He studied at Melbourne, Monash and RMIT universities. He lives and works in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. His work explores the contemplative function of painting, photo painting and installation. In particular, how new iterations of the monochrome tradition and the composite can explore the perception of time and space, complexity, impermanence, memory and feeling. He holds a PhD from RMIT University, and he was appointed as an emeritus professor in the School of Art after leaving in 2017 to concentrate on his practice. He occasionally curates and writes on contemporary Eastern and Western art. Welcome to the program, David.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you on. And listeners, as always, if you'd like to join us in the conversation, you can text us on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us. David, I know you've listened to a little bit of the show, so you probably have a feeling of what my first question is. And I'm particularly really interested in what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
The earliest memory I was thinking about this last night because I'd heard your program, and the earliest memory is of a place where I was born and grew up in a suburb of Belfast called Tochmona. And Tochmona is on the outskirts of Belfast. And at the time I grew up, it was nearly in the country. It had lots of green grass around it and a river and parklands and animals and sheep. But it was a new estate that had been developed, and the type of architecture were essentially aluminium buildings that were built after the Second World War as a result of a housing shortage. And my parents, my mother was from Northern Ireland, but my father was Welsh, and he had spent the 1930s and the war mainly in the Middle East and India. And he returned during the war to Wales. And as people know, places like Swansea, where he came from, were badly bombed, and Belfast was badly bombed. So after the war, there was a strong need for increased housing. And so some of the ideas of public housing and quick build were put into play. And this housing estate, when we lived in it, was a place where both Catholics and Protestants lived side by side very comfortably. And it was based on the idea of good quality but small public housing. My father and mother had married during the war, and they moved after the war to Swansea, where my father was born. My sister was born there, and then they moved back to Northern Ireland to be with my mother's parents in that area. Subsequently, and they lived in a place called Finnicky, which was, if you try to think of the landscape, it's a bit like Canterbury and in Melbourne, where there's a lot of trees, rolling hills, a more established suburb than Tochmona, which was next door, and probably a greater, more middle-class area. And so the typical view of people have of Belfast as, you know, of two up, two down terraces and the Troubles. And I hadn't been back to Ireland until we left in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. Came to Melbourne and I went to school here. I returned when I went and was living in London in the 70s to see my grandmother who was ill, but it was the Troubles. And it was a bizarre, crazy, very violent time. And I returned to Northern Ireland 2 years ago to have a look and to catch up with some distant relatives. So there's a background of both strange provincialism and an internationalism with my father's experience of different cultures. And also a very weird connection to the Goon Show, which was a comedy show on the BBC.
Say more, how does the comedy show fit into all that?
We used to sit and listen to the Goon Show, and that was one of the few things in common that we had in Melbourne. On the ABC, they used to have this show called the Goon Show. And one of my father's relatives had married Harry Seacombe, who was one of the goons, and I don't know if you know about the Goon Show. Do you?
I've never heard of it.
Wow, you've got a whole cultural wonder. One of the things about the Goon Show, it was basically developed in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, of people like Spike Milligan, Harry Seacombe, and a couple of other main people. And it was an absurdist show. It was basically a comedy show that sent up the establishment, really. And it was the basis for shows like the Monty Python and those things that came later. And so the idea of that type of British humour, which included, Wales from Harry Seacombe, and Spike Milligan, who was born in India, a whole range of perfect send-ups of the British establishment was part of that show. And so my grandfather and father and I used to sit around the radio when I was a young, primary school kid, and we'd listen and laugh at the Goon Show. And to my surprise, when we came to Australia, the Goon Show was on the ABC. So absurdity was the sort of continuity. Because as you come to Australia as a British migrant, it was quite interesting. There was a love-hate relationship with people who came from Britain by local Australians at the time. Some people loved you, other people thought that you were a 10-pound pom, that sort of idea. As a young child, I was mocked because I had a different accent at school. And so a lot of my early friends were from either Germany or China or later on Ceylon, those sorts of things. So I became interested in sort of multicultural ideas, things like that, quite young.
So that universal cosmopolitan international perspective comes. You talk about the absurdity of the Goon Show, but that set you free a little bit creatively in terms of eliminating maybe some of the traditional confines of what's expected.
Yes and no. It was a release. It was also a sense that it was important to laugh as well as to think and as well as to be serious. That there was a constant paradox in one's life. And most of us have got that to some degree or other. Sometimes it gets heightened when you move countries. And my parents, again, it was a mixed family, a family from two different Celtic cultures, and one Scots-Irish, the other one Welsh. And there was this sort of it was a Britishness, not an Englishness. And so there was quite a different sort of feel in the country, in our family.
Was there any Welsh or Gaelic spoken at home?
My father spoke a little bit, but he was part of that generation, especially from South Wales, that were from a working class area and that had been anglicised. And so I can tell you how to sit down and be quiet or Merry Christmas and Happy New Year in Welsh, but that's about as far as I go. And they were the essentials. So in Northern Ireland it was, English.
Had you met any artists when you were young? Did you see that as a career or a path for yourself?
Art was always something that I did, and my father would occasionally do some amateur drawings for me, really just of landscape and cattle in the fields and Irish streams and houses and things like that, the thatched roof cottage, all that sort of stuff. And we were always drawing. I used to draw everywhere really, including the edges of newspapers and do long drawings along the edge where there wasn't any print and that sort of stuff. When I came to Australia, we originally were in a migrant hostel for about, my mother couldn't stand it, so we stayed for about, I think, 3 weeks, if that. And then eventually moved and finished up in Canterbury, which was a much more mixed suburb than it is today. And there was one shop where there was this Dutch painter, and he'd sit in the shop and do these knockoffs of Rembrandt. And I just was fascinated by the way he did that. But they were different to the things that I drew as a child. One of the things I remember teaching when I was at RMIT was based on a drawing I did of a ship in Belfast Lough. And I used that as a lesson on semiotics, because if you know how to draw a wave, you either curve the wave upwards, and if you take that apart and you curve it another way and put it up high in the picture, it becomes like birds, or it becomes clouds in the sky, or it becomes steam coming out of a funnel. So the idea of a slippage of meaning through signs became, something to play with. Not that I was playing with them as a child, but when I reflect back on the flexibility of drawing and what meaning can happen through drawing, it becomes, quite amusing.
How old were you when you decided to become an artist?
I realised you could become an artist, I think it was about Form 3 at school, so that would have been, year 9. My family didn't have... The Irish side of the family in some ways were more middle class, and they were quite conservative in lots of ways. My mother always loved literature. My father loved music. So music was always evident. And the sort of way that I got into imagery were through cartoons, really, through annuals like the Daily Mail annual, where they had these characters like Rupert the Bear and stuff like that. And again, Rupert was an interesting British bear that sort of had lots of Chinese friends and travelled the world and did odd things. And as well as that, there were then a set of books called Look and Learn, which were initially for boys and girls. And it had a lot of history, a lot of art, as well as things to do with nature and other things. So that was a regular thing that I read when I was very, very young.
Do you remember it all when you first discovered abstract art? And how did that reaction feel?
Yeah, I sort of was intrigued by it. My first practice as an artist was figurative, and eventually I moved towards abstraction, because I realised that for me figuration was part of the story, not the whole story. And I guess in year 12 I was starting to look seriously, and there was a show at the National Gallery, which was then in Swanston Street, of modern art from New York, from America. And I remember going with my father, and we were standing in front of a black red Ed Reinhardt painting. And there was a woman beside us looking at it, and she complained and said, "It's just all black." And my father turned to her and said, "No, you need to look harder. It's not just all black. There are different blacks in it." And I thought, I gave my father some brownie points for that, as being, unschooled in contemporary art or modern art, as we talk about it. So by the 60s, there were, it was late 60s, I was, quite interested in art, and that's when both popular music and, popular imagery, art magazines became available. And I'd started at my first... I got into RMIT, but I didn't go there. I finished up taking a studentship and doing a secondary art and craft course at what was then Melbourne Teachers College, but then became the State College and then became part of Melbourne University. It was a place where, again, there was a tension, and again, this was the early 70s, and there was the Vietnam War. There was a lot of tension about what sort of art you should make, what was relevant, and so on. And so I became very interested in questioning the nature of the sort of art we do and what its values were. At the same time as making art and trying to study it in quite a conservative institution at that time. There were a couple of well-known contemporary painters, but a lot of the lecturers in that institution were quite conservative.
And your work was still quite figurative at this time?
Yes, but it was also political. And I used to work as a cartoonist for Melbourne University newspaper and other student papers. And so the overt political stuff came out in that sort of way. And eventually I was asked to leave the Melbourne Teachers College in my final year because there were various parts of the program. One included woodwork and craft, metal craft, as well as painting and the visual arts and education, sociology, blah, blah, blah. And I was asked to leave because of two reasons. One, I'd organised some student protests that were in favour of defending some of our students that were asked to leave because they were on student demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations. And the other was that instead of making tables or things like that in woodwork, I made a series of boxes with mortise and tenon joints, really badly made mortise and tenon joints. I give them credit for that. But these boxes had no bottoms in them. And the idea was that they would be placed on grass and that you'd mow around them and eventually you'd take the box away and you'd be left with cubes of grass. And the other boxes had different levels of dirt in them, so that they were sort of conceptual investigations of probably earth art to some degree, in a very naive way. At the same time as that, I was working figuratively and building up, I guess, a skill base and a knowledge base of colour. And then I finished up, getting my qualifications in teaching and went teaching in the country in Currumborough, and eventually came back to Australia. No, back to Melbourne. Oops, that was a Freudian slip. Back to Melbourne. And
it was a different world, was it, in the country?
It was indeed. And then I had met my wife then, who had been at college, but she had done a different program, and we finished up when we were teaching. We got together and became a couple, and we worked on a experimental school, trying to develop an experimental school. I was working at a reasonably free school, again a school that tested, vertical streaming, no uniforms, smoking, all the other stuff that kids could do in the 70s. And I developed a subject called stupidity, which was an elective and very popular. And that's where I think the Goon Show kicked in. And we did, again, an influence of Monty Python, the Department of Funny Walks. We did a lot of political cartooning about a way of trying to use visual imagery to talk about social issues, things like that.
What do you think is the number one lesson that you wanted to impart on students then, but you still carry through the rest of your academic career and you still feel people need to learn now? Is there one recurring lesson like that?
One is to be, I suppose, generous, to be tolerant, and to ask questions, to accept your curiosity and trust it. Yeah.
Good lessons.
Yeah, well, I'm still trying to get them right.
I think it's a life's work, some of those. Some of those are an eternal life's work practice. And then I wonder, when you finally made the jump and sort of stepped away from figurative works and fully into the practice that you're really known for, and the minimal and abstract art. Was it a gentle leap or a strong one? Was it any fear around that?
Oh, it was a strange time. It was because my work had been reasonably successful, and I guess in the 1970s, when I went back to the UK, and we lived both in Europe, in France, and London, I was still working figuratively, but I was opening up to a whole range of other influences, including there was a French art historian called Elie Faure, who wrote a book called L'Esprit des Formes, which was the spirit of the forms. And he was a doctor who wrote the first history of art that included, in French, that included in its, I think it was 9 volumes, Eastern art, Chinese art, Japanese art, art from Oceania, Indian art, South American art, classical Greek art, and then the Western canon through the Gothic and Renaissance. And these 2 volumes that complemented those other volumes were about the importance of place in affecting style and form, in particular form. So he would argue that without the Seine Valley and the atmospherics of the Seine Valley, you wouldn't have had Impressionism. Or without the clarity of the Mediterranean Greece, you wouldn't have had Classicism. Or without the jungles of southern India, you wouldn't have had Hindu temples and structures like that had that organic quality and richness. So I've been shown these volumes in Australia, but I wanted to read them in more depth, and so I went and lied and said I was a student and got access to the reading room in the British Museum, and had these volumes in English because it was only available in French. Apart from that, and my French was not quite up to that at that stage. So I was able to read those and have these books delivered to me and have time reading it. And when I had a break from reading those upstairs, there was an amazing exhibition of traditional Chinese Sung painting. And I was knocked over by this because...
What is Sung painting?
Sung painting is from the Sung dynasty, and they were essentially contemplative landscape paintings out of the Chinese tradition of ink painting from probably, I think they were the 13th century. And the relationship between volume or between something present and something absent was beautifully articulated. So philosophically, they were very interesting about something and nothing and about change. And these are still things that I'm interested in today. And so I became fascinated by that, as well as reading Ellie Ford's volume on Chinese art. I decided to have a look at that in more detail. So as you leave the British Museum at that stage, there was an Oriental art bookshop across the road. So I went across the road and picked up a book on the principles of Chinese painting, which helped me understand what I was doing in my own work, both figuratively and whatever. So over the next probably decade, my work slowly evolved into not just dealing with visual description and representation, but questioning that and not just looking at not that any art just looks at the exterior, but I found that the skill that I'd developed as a realist painter got in the way of some of the other ideas that I was trying to get across. And I'd been showing at quite a well-known gallery in Melbourne when I returned in the 70s, and work had been acquired by certain museums and stuff. So to change was quite a big step, and it was to do with the need to try and express something beyond the surface.
The ideas, right? The ideas have a life and a will, and they almost demand to be brought into existence.
Yes.
And in many ways, that's the same in architecture and or many other creative practices. That the idea has its own will to become real.
Mm.
Then I wonder, there's a massive lesson here for our listeners, for myself, for truly everyone. It's so brave to have something that works, right? It gets exhibited, it gets collected. You've built this body of work, a reputation is emerging. And then in yourself you have to pivot.
Mm. And it wasn't, again, it was very strange because in those days in the 80s, Melbourne was quite tribal in terms of various, the art world.
It still is really, isn't it?
Yeah, the art world was different though because you had basically a range of galleries.
Yes.
And, architects would be familiar with all of those at a particular time. And you had newspapers. There were about 4 newspapers that would review art every week. So there was a commonality that happened that young students or young artists or older artists could read about and have a common discussion about. There was the Saturday crawl around galleries that people used to make. These days those things have shifted because that commonality of, not of agreement but of discourse, has shifted because of things like the internet. No, you don't have newspapers in Australia, in Melbourne, talking about the same things, having different opinions about them. You don't have the commonality of these galleries. You have different groupings of artists, again, that are just as connected to the internet as they are to the reality of the world around them and the physicality of that world in quite a different way. So those things, I think, make it both difficult for younger artists to find a physical engagement with materiality. And I think it's probably a similar thing in architecture too, that often the buildings that were done in the early days depended on people's understanding of materiality, not just of design form.
And you had to physically see them to review them. The pretty photo, the Instagram shot of the public, the pretty printed image, right, in books and publications wasn't enough. The buildings used to be understood more so in their mass.
Yes.
Which is why events like Melbourne Open House are so rare and amazing and needed in our city.
Exactly. And again, one of the things I found really valuable when I travelled in Europe in the 70s was that the guidebook that I used was a book by, again, a French writer from the late 19th century called Émile Malle. and he wrote a book called The Gothic Image, which is essentially looking at 13th century Gothic cathedrals and religious art and architecture. So I decided to follow that, and you finished up in very strange places looking at amazing Gothic cathedrals. And one of the things that I found really important about that was that again, you might find it interesting, but it probably links to someone like Gottfried Simper, the German theorist, who I quite like stirring architects by saying that, you know, Simper's idea of the wall was not a structural thing, it was a thing to carry imagery on. And that was its role. It wasn't just to support the roof. And that comes out of his understanding of works from the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the function of weaving as imagery. And the Gothic cathedral in some ways is like that. You know, it was a type of architecture that soared, unlike the weightiness of the gravity of classical architecture.
As my professors used to say, it was architecture for the illiterate. They had to have the imagery to show the consequences of non-compliance.
Yes, and also the celebration of those things were made by communities. And another architect that I like listening to, because he never finishes his lectures, is Lars Spoybrook. And his book, The Sympathy of Things, Ruskin and Digital Ecology of Design or something like that. Do you know that book?
No.
Yeah. He's very interesting because he talks about the sympathy between the components in Gothic architecture. The way, for example, that columns are not just piled up on top of one another, but they're based on the idea of clumps of wood really being put together but then transformed into stone that soar, and that clumping together of these forms that are in sympathy with each other are really interesting. The idea of a symmetry in Gothic architecture, the idea that each column reflects the person that made it in a very different way to the classical column, so that the decoration on the Gothic cathedral often reflects the stonemasons that made it, as well as the idiosyncratic variations of it. I would often talk to my students as the cathedral as the first multidisciplinary type of art that you could look at, because it was site-specific. It changed as the seasons changed, as light came in. The iconography was sort of had a certain commonality, but it was both sculptural, it was pictorial, it had a performative element through the liturgy, it had a sonic component through song. It was a very complex sort of set of experiences that one had. And if you're going to look at contemporary installation practice and multidisciplinary practice, you can learn a lot from looking at Gothic.
Immense parallels.
Yeah.
I will add that it's also really the first type of building that required a master builder, who then became the discipline and the profession of architecture, to bring it all together, to coordinate everyone, to make it stand up and take responsibility for standing it up.
Yes, and also the iconography was a thing that came out of a range of cultural values and cultural histories, because the iconography developed over centuries as the cathedral developed over centuries, so it was not static. And when you add all of those components, from the clothes that the priests wore to the tapestries or whatever, you finish up, you've got an organic, ever-changing set of relationships that operate. So that book
was a big influence for you.
Yeah, it was quite important, and so the Gothic is the way that I understand the Gothic is really quite interesting, because someone like Ruskin, who investigated that, was not just an upper class English twit. He was partly that, but he was also an ecologist, and he was also a person that supported the Working Man's College. So RMIT, for example, comes out of that tradition from the mid 19th century, 1851, I think, around about that period, where the Working Men's College was developed so that craftsmen and others from a working class background could be educated and have knowledge. And they impacted in the development of institutions like RMIT, which is, paradoxical when you start up talking about the Gothic and you finish up with the Gothic. Perhaps it's the horror Gothic. I don't know at RMIT. No.
I do think about how it's so interesting that people who haven't had much exposure, perhaps, and listeners who aren't unfamiliar with contemporary art and abstract art, can find it very challenging. And as you said in that anecdote of yourself and your father in the museum, it's just black. Like they find it very hard to access. But in looking at all these ideas and your reflections, you see that your work, quite abstract, is heavily informed by very, very old ideas, 13th century Chinese landscape and Gothicism and those ideas of space that have come out into the 3D world that you then try to bring back into the 2D for us to experience again in 3D.
Yes, well, I mean, the work also has another component which I think is really important. It's called the composite. So the abstract is one component, but it also often uses photography, and it often uses installation as well. So these components sit in time, not just space.
Yes.
And so they unfold in time and content. And that is a critical part. And that both comes out of contemporary practice and again in the... I've spent a lot of time... I was awarded a residency by the French government at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris in the early 90s for a year. And I became aware of French art of the 1960s as well as those historical moments that we've always been interested in. And also the connections between France and the Orient in a very different way to Britain and the Orient or to Australia and the North. So that the richness of those sorts of experiences and the way we oversimplify for educational purposes and the way that our experience in education is, and as artists, is so informed by the English language, so that our dominant influences were obviously from the UK and the United States, as well as our own traditions that have developed. But it's only recently that we've started to appreciate Indigenous culture.
Yeah.
We've only recently been able to engage with the art of our region, both in the Pacific and in north of us, from Indonesia through Singapore to China, Korea, Japan, in a holistic way. And those discussions, those interactions have been things that I've been interested in for a long time. But also I've tried to bring into, when I was teaching, into curricula. And they started also to become these common things. So one of the interesting areas that I'll be talking about at the Justin Art House Museum are movements like the Gutai movement in Japan or the Monoha movement or the monochrome movement in Korea, which uses forms that have got very similar initial appearances to sort of Western minimalism or Western abstraction, and some of them were informed not just by American colour field but by art infernal from France and Europe and Germany. But they were also informed by their local contemplative traditions and their local use of materials. So when you actually see the works, they come out of a local context, and this local global discussion is something that's critical for both architecture and its relationship of understanding place, but understanding that we are not just nationalistic, fascists. We need to be open to the world. And one of the problems, I think, in the world, one of the values that we need to continue to explore is those values of tolerance, those values of difference, and the way that we can engage with discussion and difference together in what the definition of a composite is that things aren't unified, they are reconciled. And that comes out of an old French theorist, Henri Bergson, who had wonderful writings on duration and time. And he emphasised the difference between our felt ongoing time, our interior time, and the external time and experiences that we have as individuals. So in order to understand what we do when we look at art is actually understand ourselves. We understand our own limits and what we're looking at. So when you're looking at an abstract work and you haven't seen one before, you're perhaps applying the wrong rules to it if you're not experiencing something. But if you drop the rules and say, what is it that I'm actually experiencing in this?
And come with a sense of openness.
Yeah. And what do I feel in this as well as what do I know? What you know can come later. But what you feel, what the sensations that you get are critical. And that's the same with building, in the homes that we live in. It's all very well having a cool modernist style or a neo-Gothic style or whatever it is, but you have to feel those things. And then you can add or question or you can identify that. It's a bit like, as I say, applying the wrong rules to things. So if you're trying to understand soccer by applying Australian rules, football rules, you're not going to get anywhere. But you need to understand the rules to some degree to understand the thrill of the game.
Yes.
And that applies, I think, very much to willing to take baby steps in learning how to look and then how to have the confidence to say, I've got no idea about this.
So important.
Yeah.
One of the greatest characteristics of wisdom, really, is almost to say, I don't know.
I must be really wise.
You find those questions coming up for yourself a lot.
I've got no idea.
I want to ask you also about something that's really prevalent in your work, and that is colour, and particularly yellow.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to that transition from figuration to when I was working as a figurative artist, as I said, and there's a bit of a cycle going on at the moment, which I quite like. I'd like drawing my friends, and I'd sit around and when I was at school, I'd be drawing teachers or students and stuff like that without permission, or sometimes with permission. And the kids would call me, this shows the date, they'd call me an Instamatic camera because they would think that the work that I did was so realistic that they'd enjoy it. And I'd often give those works to either the students or to my friends. And occasionally I'd exhibit them and sell them. But that idea of the skill of them became, a limitation for me, as I suggested before. But the joy of actually looking and analysing and trying to understand relationship of form, colour, tone, became interesting. So that taught me about the nuancing of colour. But it didn't taught me anything really about the saturation of colour or the expanse of colour and the way that visual sensation can operate when you have large fields of colour. The abstract art for me also had a sense of infinity, whereas the figurative drawing and later the photography had a sense of the specific.
Yes.
So those two things were in dialogue because that's the way I feel about life. We're in the middle of this universe. Wow, it's great. It's an amazing place. It's got horror, it's got joy, it's got love, it's got hate. It's got all of these things, and we're sort of on this crazy planet, in the middle of it all. And we need to be in awe of the privilege it is to be alive, because we are so privileged, unlike so many in the world today that are starving. It's just horrific what's going on in the world. And we need to both appreciate what we have got, but also know how to be able to share those things. And knowledge and sensibility are things of value that we can share. I've got a German friend who was a doctor, and he gave up being a doctor, he said, to do something valuable, which was to make art. And that, in our logical terms, seems crazy.
That would flip it on its toes for a lot of people.
But he'd been working in Africa, and he saw that the value of these people had nothing. They had culture, and that was the thing that enabled them to understand their relationships with themselves and with the planet. And those are the sort of aims that I think, the underlying values that art can offer us if we give it time and if we do enough work on trying to understand what the various arts do to us and how we understand them. So to go back to your original question, and forgive my banging on about this, tell me to shut up if you
I've
need
enjoyed
to.
the journey to it, but I am curious about the yellow.
Well, the yellow comes out of when I started making this movement away from hyper-realism realism to abstraction. I reduced my means and started to do tonal paintings of an object that was in the centre of vision and played with central vision and peripheral vision. They were grey. They were black and white and grey. And so at some point I thought there was something missing, which was colour. And although black and white and grey are colour, this higher keyed colour was missing. So I looked for the most, at that stage I was using oils, the most luminous colour I could find. And within this French brand of paint, which is La Franc-Bourgeois, at the time there was a paint called Imitation Lemon Japanese Yellow. And that was a sort of very cold yellow. And that became the luminous part that played in relationship to these tonal fields. And eventually when you mixed black with this yellow, you finished up with this greeny tinge. And for a while this became the palette that I used for a long time in the 90s. And eventually that obviously ran out of steam, and eventually the palette expanded and other things started to happen. But this question of materiality and luminosity, or form and atmosphere, started to occur. So when you look at if you give it time and you look at one of my monochrome paintings of colour, it shifts in perception from a surface to an atmosphere. And that's where the felt and the material start to play together. Then you look at the way that it's painted, and often they're very gently painted. They're not.
Yes, you do this perfect, seamless, soft blur in between.
Yeah, yes, but that's in particular the one that comes from the 90s that's in the Justin Art House exhibition.
Currently on show as part of Minimal.
Yes, yes. And that work was acquired from a type of survey show from the Design Hub at RMIT in 2017. And the work was actually made in 2000 and... no, it wasn't. When was it made? 1992. So it's quite an old work now when you start to think about them. But, you know, again, it's a cyclical thing in our understandings and our feelings.
I want to ask actually about that life cycle time gap, and perhaps you have some advice to younger artists and across their listenership. The work was created in 92. It was exhibited at a survey show 20 years later, a bit more, 2017, and was sold then. What have you learnt throughout your long and continuous practice as an artist about self-belief and tenacity?
Yes, well, I think, stupidity is a wonderful thing. And if you've got... There's something, I think, as an artist that you can recognise that certain works have got a resonance Like, again, that's one of the other elements that I think about the monochrome, that it's an empty space, but it's a space of potential resonance. And I think that's one of the joys of bringing your own attitude to it. If you're just going to see it as a material thing, that's what happens. So within one's own work, if you start to have that feedback that your work is doing something for you, and then you have a small audience that support it, like we're not in isolation. We're part of a culture. We're part of a community of artists. I was part of a very important educational structure, an art school. And that art school was part of a very broad international community where we would not only have international students coming to us, but we'd deliver programs in situ in various regional cities. And so you become immersed in other cultures and you get feedback from other cultures. So although my art used to be criticised when I started as being too European because I'd spent time in Europe, they thought. But my work came out of a different place than just evolving from that style. I'm a Westerner. I come out of a culture that was informed both by British and European traditions and by, my both support of and my reactions to those things and my reactions to American art and the international global art. And then slowly a growing awareness of how local places interpreted those ideas that were common or became common currency differently. And so if you have that and you start to say, look, hang on, I'm still curious about this, but this work seems to be hanging in there and a few of my supporters seem to like it as well, then you can hang around until that curator retires or someone else comes in that recognise it. But one of the problems for artists, I think, and I presume it's the same with architects, you can correct me, but art is often generational. You go through school with a particular range of students, they become your peers. You're not in agreement with all of them, but you're in agreement with some of them. You're sharing experiences with them. There are curators that go through generationally a similar time with you. And there are issues that are generational that seem to be relevant, that, bond people together. Mm. But those generations change and shift. Unfortunately, some of them pass away. But attitudes shift, curators shift jobs, collectors, get to a particular age, they start to downsize. When new curators come in, and this happened to a lot of friends of mine in France, when there was a downturn in the 90s, their collector base was, and these were artists of a generation older than me, that their collector base were downsizing, their galleries were closing, the curators had retired. They were therefore left in a particular doldrums. The new curators that were coming in were supporting their generation. The new collectors were supporting their generation. Some of the other curators were making their work of these people historical and locating it in a particular era, not looking at their contemporary thing. So from that, my lesson to young artists is become multi-generational, mix with different people, talk to different people, not just the people in your bubble.
I love how this conversation has come full circle from the really tight-knit immediate local to ideas of the global and the international, and how openness and interconnection is so important in that practice. And in fact, all these relationships, right, and connections that we've discussed are inextricably interconnected.
Yes, it's a lifetime. And I think that's the beauty. We're all on a life journey, and you don't have to be an artist to realise the richness and what art does, I think, is it can make you look attentively at things, and you can pay attention to things. It trains you to think, it trains you to look, it trains you to ascribe value to those activities. And it's important to realise that, we are really just dealing with values, all of us, no matter whether we're an artist or not. What our values are in the world are critical
looking to make
well-being.
meaning.
Yes, and what makes meaning and how we can share that meaning. And, we'll leave it at that if you like.
I am. We are right, pretty much right on time, and I'm mindful of the time, so I will ask my last question, and that is, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Love. The fact that people can be kind to each other as well as being horrific to each other. There's always, on the local level, wonderful people that give you a sense of empathy with other people. I'm fortunate enough to do some volunteer work with Peter Mack, and when you see the way that those people care and the researchers research through knowledge but also through intuition and through sensitivity, and the bottom line of their activities are always about care. And as an educator, I always believed in student-centred learning. And my role was not to let people work in my style, because I was having enough trouble with that myself. But my role was to help them to discover what they found of value through asking enough questions, just like you are doing.
And that, in effect, is an act of love. And I notice love is in your book title that you've brought in, but we've been chatting away, so there's not even been a moment to read it. Would you read out your book title for us?
It's called Love Poem to Life.
Love Poem to Life. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, David.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of radio architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hi, my name's Paul Kennedy and I'm a sport reporter for the ABC, and when I'm not listening to the ABC, I listen to Radio Karim. Tune in and enjoy.